Records found in a hidden courthouse room in Richmond, Virginia, during repairs in 1932 showed something that upset local history experts so much that the papers were quietly hidden again and marked as not important. Between 1847 and 1851, plantation owners across 7 counties in central Virginia reported the same impossible thing. Slave children, some as young as 6 years old, were being caught with written notes, rough journals, and in one case, a complete handwritten copy of parts of a book no slave should have ever touched. 63 separate events were written down in the first year alone. Each child, when asked separately and sometimes months apart, gave the same strange answer about the night teacher. Every search led to nothing. Every trail went cold. Police at the time ended their reports with different versions of the same words: source unidentified, threat level severe. What those plantation owners were scared of was not just reading and writing. It was the realization that someone had been moving through their land for years, completely unseen, teaching what was against the law and punishable by death. This person knew their schedules, the places they did not watch, and their weak spots. He moved like smoke through their land, and despite guards, dogs, and more desperate attempts to watch everything, he stayed invisible. The mental impact on the rich owners was huge. If their control was so total, how had this happened right under their noses? If one man could do this, what else was happening that they could not see? Before we go on with the story of the man who became Virginia's most wanted ghost, make sure to follow this channel and press that bell button so you never miss stories like this, and leave a comment below telling us what state or city you are watching from. We love hearing from our group around the world. What makes this case especially scary is that it was not found through careful police work or someone admitting it, but through the careless trust of children who did not yet understand the danger they were in. And when the truth finally came out, it showed a web of secret schooling so smart and wide that it challenged everything the plantation system believed about itself. Cumberland County, Virginia, in the fall of 1847 was a place of opposites. Rolling hills covered in tobacco fields stretched toward the James River, and the county roads connected over 40 plantations of different sizes, from huge estates with hundreds of enslaved workers to small farms with a dozen. The dirt was rich, the crops made money, and the social order was thought by those who benefited from it to be unbreakable. The county had survived Nat Turner's fight 16 years earlier without any local trouble, and the rich owners had come out with their confidence stronger. They had tightened their rules, improved their watching, and convinced themselves that their system was perfect. The land itself worked to create a false sense of safety. The plantations were connected by a web of roads, some kept well and used often, others barely more than cart paths through the woods. Between the planted fields lay stretches of forest, oak, pine, and hickory that had been left mostly alone because the land was too rocky or too wet for farming. These woods created natural lines between properties, and while the planters knew them well enough to hunt in, they rarely walked them effectively. The forests were thought of as empty spaces, useful only for wood and hunting. The James River curved through the eastern part of the county, giving a way to move goods and people. Flatboats moved tobacco down to Richmond and returned with supplies. Along the river banks stood old mills, some still working, others left empty when their owners died or moved west. These buildings dotted the land like forgotten statues, slowly being taken back by plants. The Carver plantation sat along the northern edge of the county, a medium-sized business with 73 enslaved people, and a name for being what the owner, Thomas Carver, called well managed. Carver was a third-generation tobacco planter, a man who was proud of his large library and his membership in the Virginia Agricultural Society. He kept perfect records of everything: crop amounts, weather changes, births and deaths among the enslaved people, costs and profits. His books were works of art filled with neat rows and detailed notes. He read farming papers, wrote to other planters about the best ways to do things, and went to regional meetings where men talked about soil and bug control with the seriousness of scholars. Carver's library was his safe place, a room lined floor to ceiling with books on farming, history, thinking, and religion. He spent his evenings there, reading by lamplight, making notes on the edges of his books. He thought of himself as a learned man, a thinking man, someone who understood the world through logic and order. His world view was built on the sure thought that society worked according to natural laws, and that these laws placed different people in different spots for logical reasons. His wife, Elizabeth Carver, managed the house with quiet skill. She watched over the house workers, planned meals, hosted guests, and kept the social ties that were key to the family's standing in the town. She was involved in the local church, organized help for poor white families, and believed truly that she was a kind force in the lives of those who worked in her home. Among the enslaved people on the Carver plantation was a girl named Ruth, 8 years old, who worked in the main house under the eyes of the head housekeeper, a woman named Dinah. Ruth had been born on the plantation, the daughter of a field worker named Sarah, and a father she had never known, sold away before she was born. Ruth was small for her age, quiet and watchful. She had learned early to move through rooms without drawing looks, to know needs before they were spoken, to read the moods of the white family with the care needed for staying safe. Ruth worked from sunrise until well after dark. She swept floors, carried water, cleaned silver, and helped in the kitchen. She slept in a small room off the kitchen with 3 other girls, and her whole world consisted of the main house, the yard, and the short moments of freedom she found in the early morning before her work began or late at night after the family had gone to bed. She had never been to school. The idea of school as something that existed for children was strange to her. She knew that the Carver children, 2 boys ages 10 and 12, studied with a teacher who came twice a week, and she had seen them sitting at desks, bent over books, writing on slates. But that world was as far from her as the moon. Until the night, everything changed. It was late summer 1846, more than a year before Ruth's discovery would set everything in motion. The tobacco harvest was coming close, and the feeling on the plantation was tight with waiting and tiredness. Everyone worked longer hours, and by nightfall most people fell into sleep. Ruth had been sent to the spring house to get butter for the morning's breakfast cooking. The spring house was a small stone building built over a cold stream located about 100 yards from the main house at the edge of the woods. It was evening, the sky fading from orange to deep purple, and Ruth carried a tin lantern that cast nervous shadows on the path. She got the butter and was walking back when she noticed something odd. Near the old tobacco barn, a building that hadn't been used for storage in years, and stood partly hidden by tall weeds, there was a faint light barely visible through the holes in the wooden walls. Ruth stopped walking. She knew she should return to the house right away. Being curious was dangerous, but something about that light pulled her forward. She set down her lantern and moved quietly through the tall grass toward the barn. As she got close, she heard a voice, not loud, but clear and calm, a man's voice. "This is the letter A. It makes the sound you hear at the start of apple. Can you say it with me?" Ruth crept closer and looked through a hole in the barn wall. Inside, lit by a small covered lantern, she saw a man she didn't know. He was tall with dark skin and graying hair, wearing simple work clothes. In front of him sat 3 children, 2 boys and a girl all around her age. They were sitting on the dirt floor, staring hard at something the man was drawing in the dust with a stick. "A," the children said again. "Good," the man said. "Now watch how I write it." He drew the letter carefully, explaining each line. Then he handed the stick to one of the boys. "Your turn." Ruth watched, unable to move as the boy traced the letter in the dirt, his tongue sticking out in deep thought. The man praised him, fixed his grip on the stick, and had him try again. Ruth didn't know how long she stood there, but eventually the man stood up and looked directly at the hole where she was watching. She froze, her heart beating fast. "You can come in if you want," he said gently. "But you have to be very quiet." Ruth paused, then slowly pushed open the barn door and stepped inside. The 3 children looked at her with wide eyes, but the man smiled. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ruth," she whispered. "I am Jacob," he said. "Do you want to learn?" Ruth nodded, unable to speak. Jacob pointed to a space on the floor. "Sit down. We just started." That night, Ruth learned the letter A. Jacob showed her how to make it, how to know it, how to sound it out. He was patient and kind, never rushing, never yelling. When the lesson ended, perhaps only 30 minutes later, Jacob carefully wiped all the letters from the dirt floor and told the children to go home. "Don't tell anyone about this," he said, his voice serious. "Not your parents, not your friends, not anyone. This is our secret. Do you understand?" They all nodded. "If anyone finds out, I will have to leave and you won't be able to learn anymore. So, you have to be very, very careful." Ruth walked back to the main house in a fog, the butter forgotten in her hand until Dinah scolded her for taking so long. But that night, lying on her mat in the dark, Ruth traced the letter A on the floor with her finger over and over until she fell asleep. Over the following weeks, Ruth returned to the barn whenever she could slip away unseen. Jacob came at different times, sometimes once a week, sometimes not for 2 weeks, but when he came, he always taught. The group of children grew slowly. Jacob never brought more than 5 or 6 at a time, and he was careful about changing the nights and times so that no pattern could be seen. Ruth learned the alphabet. She learned how letters mixed to make sounds, how sounds made words. Jacob used dirt, charcoal, and sometimes small pieces of slate he had somehow got. He never brought books, too dangerous. But he spoke parts from memory, and had the children say them again, connecting spoken words to written letters. For Ruth, it was like finding a hidden room in a house she thought she knew completely. The world, which had always seemed set and unchangeable, suddenly held chances she hadn't imagined. Words weren't just sounds. They were shapes, patterns, things that could be caught and held. The morning of October 12th, 1847 began like any other. Ruth woke before sunrise, helped make breakfast, and began her daily cleaning list. By mid-morning she was in the parlor, Thomas Carver's private office, dusting the bookshelves. The room was filled with morning light coming through tall windows. Leather-bound books lined the walls, their spines stamped with gold letters. Carver's desk sat in the center of the room, covered with papers, books, and letters. Ruth worked slowly, using a soft cloth to wipe each shelf, careful not to move the order of books. She had cleaned this room hundreds of times, but today something was different. One of Carver's journals lay open on his desk, and Ruth, thinking herself alone, walked to it. She had been learning for over a year now, and her skills had moved far beyond the alphabet. She could read simple sentences and with work more hard parts. The journal was filled with Carver's neat handwriting. Ruth leaned over it, her eyes scanning the page. It was a note about crop amounts, notes about which fields had made the best tobacco, thoughts about weather patterns. Ruth's lips moved silently as she read. The western field continues to do better than hopes. The soil mix, helped by last year's work, has proven perfect for what are you doing. Ruth's blood turned to ice. She spun around to find Elizabeth Carver standing in the doorway, a basket of sewing in her hands. Mrs. Carver's face showed confusion, then growing horror as she realized what she had just seen. "Were you reading that?" Mrs. Carver's voice was barely above a whisper. Ruth opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her mind raced. She could deny it, claim she was just looking at the book, pretend she didn't understand the question. But Mrs. Carver's look told her it was too late. She had been seen unmistakably reading. "Answer me," Mrs. Carver said, her voice getting louder. "Were you reading my husband's journal?" Ruth's voice was tiny. "Yes, ma'am." The basket fell from Mrs. Carver's hands, spilling thread and cloth across the floor. She stared at Ruth as though she were seeing a ghost or something worse, something that broke the basic order of reality. How is that possible?" Mrs. Carver took a step forward. "Who taught you?" Ruth shook her head, tears beginning to run down her face. "I can't say, ma'am. Please, I can't say." Mrs. Carver's face went through a fast mix of feelings. Shock, fear, anger, and something else that Ruth couldn't name. She turned and ran from the room, calling for her husband. Within minutes, Thomas Carver appeared, his face dark with anger. He grabbed Ruth by the arm and pulled her into the center of the room. "Show me," he ordered, placing an open book in front of her. "Read this now." With a shaking voice, Ruth read the part aloud. It was from a history book, something about European wars. She tripped over some of the words, but the meaning was clear enough. She could read. Carver closed the book slowly, his jaw tight. "Who taught you this?" "I don't know his name," Ruth said, which was a lie, but one she would protect with her life. "Where did you learn?" "I can't tell you," she said. "If I told anyone, he would leave and I could never learn again." Carver's eyes narrowed. "Is it someone on this plantation?" Ruth shook her head. "I don't know where he comes from. Are there other children who can read?" Ruth paused, then nodded slowly. Carver and his wife exchanged a long look. The meaning was sinking in. This wasn't a single event. This was planned. "Get Hackett," Carver said to his wife, "and send someone to gather every child on this property between 6 and 12 years old. Every single one immediately." The gathering of children took nearly 2 hours. 21 children were gathered in the front yard of the Carver plantation, standing in an uneven line, their faces showing confusion and fear. Most of them had been pulled away from their morning jobs, and they didn't understand what was happening. Hackett, the head guard, stood to one side with 2 other white workers, watching the group with suspicion. Thomas Carver emerged from the main house, carrying a large slate and a piece of chalk. He had come up with a simple test. He would write a sentence on the slate, show it to each child one by one, and ask them to read it aloud. Most children, he assumed, would stare at the letters without understanding, but he needed to know how many had been touched by this secret schooling. The first child, a boy named Peter, aged 10, looked at the slate with real confusion. "I don't know what that says, sir," he mumbled. "Look closely," Carver insisted. Peter looked hard at the letters. "I can't read, sir." Carver moved to the next child, then the next. 14 children in a row showed no knowledge of the written words. They were, as expected, unable to read. But the 15th child, a girl named Hannah, looked at the slate and her eyes widened slightly. She glanced at Ruth, who was standing to the side under guard, then back at the slate. "Well," Carver demanded. Hannah's voice was barely heard. "It says the sun rises in the east." A whisper ran through the gathered adults. Carver's jaw tightened. "And who taught you to read?" Hannah stared at the ground. "The night teacher." "What is the night teacher's name?" "He never told us his name." Carver continued down the line. Out of 21 children, 5 could read well, and 2 others knew some letters, but couldn't form whole words. 7 children in total had been taught. The discovery sent shock waves through the Carver house. Thomas Carver immediately sent riders to nearby plantations with orders to do similar tests. Within 3 days, reports began flooding back, and each one deepened the mystery. At the Whitley estate 6 miles to the west, 5 children could read. At the Brennan plantation, 4 children. At the small Collins farm, 2 children. Across 7 different properties in Cumberland County, a total of 16 children, now including the 7 from the Carver plantation, had been taught to read and write, and every single child, when asked separately, told the same story. A man came at night. He taught them in secret places, old barns, empty mills, openings in the woods. He used dirt, charcoal, and slate. He was kind and patient. He made them promise never to tell his name or tell anyone about the lessons. And he came and went like a shadow, never seen by adults, never leaving proof behind. The planters were confused and terrified. How had one man moved so freely between their properties? How had he missed every patrol, every guard, every form of watching they had in place? And most disturbing of all, how many more children had he taught that they hadn't yet found? On October 19th, 1847, Thomas Carver held an emergency meeting of plantation owners at his estate. 11 men gathered in the large dining room, sitting around a big wood table that had been covered with maps, reports, and letters. The feeling was tight, the air thick with cigar smoke and barely hidden panic. Carver stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on a stack of papers. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are facing a danger we have never seen. Someone has been secretly teaching slave children to read and write across many properties in this county. Based on our search so far, we have found at least 23 cases, but I believe that number is low. There may be many more we haven't found yet." James Whitley, a thin man with sharp features, leaned forward. "My guard has questioned every adult on my property. No one admits to knowing anything about this. The children all describe the same person, a man who comes at night, but none of them can or will provide a name." "Same on my land," said Martin Grayson, a heavy-set man with a red face. "It is like he is a damned ghost. My workers are out in the fields all day, and we have night guards, but somehow this man has been slipping through for God knows how long." Robert Brennan, the youngest of the group, spoke up. Could it be someone from outside the county, someone traveling through? Carver shook his head. "The children report regular lessons over a long time. This isn't a one-time thing. This is a sustained campaign of schooling that's been going on for at least a year, possibly longer. Whoever this person is, they know our lands very well. They know our schedules, our blind spots, our times, which suggests," said Samuel Porter slowly, "that it is someone we know, someone who has real reasons to be moving between plantations." The room fell silent as this meaning sank in. "A tradesman," Whitley said, "someone who fixes tools, brings goods, provides services." "Or one of our own people," Grayson added, "someone we trust enough to let them move around freely." Carver pulled out a map of Cumberland County and spread it across the table. He had marked each plantation where reading children had been found with a red X. "Look at the pattern," he said. "The affected lands form a rough circle about 15 miles wide. In the center of that circle," he tapped a point on the map, "is the old Appomattox Mill Road. It is barely used anymore, but it connects to several of our lands through forest paths." Porter studied the map. "I have a carpenter named Jacob who travels that route often. I have given him permission to take on repair work at other plantations to add to his value." "He has been doing it for years." "Jacob," Carver repeated, making a note. "What do you know about him?" "He is in his 40s, highly skilled, reliable. I bought him about 20 years ago from an estate sale in North Carolina. He has never given me any trouble, quite the opposite. He is one of my most valuable workers." "Can he read?" Carver asked. Porter paused. I have never tested him. I have never had reason to think he could." "Test him," Carver said. "Soon, and in the meantime, I suggest we all make lists of anyone, slave or free, black or white, who has regular access to many properties, tradesmen, sellers, preachers, anyone who travels?" The men agreed, and the meeting continued for several more hours as they discussed security steps, punishment for the children who had been taught, and plans for finding the mystery teacher. But beneath the practical talks ran a current of fear. Their entire system of control had been broken, and they didn't know how deep the break went. Jacob had been a carpenter on the Porter plantation for over 20 years, but his story began long before that in a different life that he rarely allowed himself to remember in detail. He had been born in Maryland in 1008 on a small farm owned by a Quaker family named Hadley. William Hadley, the father of the family, believed slavery was a moral evil, but had got enslaved people when his father died. Rather than sell them, which he thought was an even bigger evil, he had kept them, but treated them as something closer to paid workers. Hadley paid them small wages, allowed them to keep gardens and sell their food, and most surprisingly, taught them to read and write. Jacob had learned to read by age 8. Hadley's wife Mary had taught him using the same books she used with her own children. By age 12, Jacob could read well and write clearly. He had read the Bible cover to cover twice, and he had seen newspapers, farming papers, and even some philosophy. He knew that his reading was strange, even dangerous, but within the safe place of the Hadley farm, it had seemed natural. When William Hadley died unexpectedly in 1027, everything changed. Hadley's adult son, who had moved to Philadelphia and held different views, returned to settle the estate. He had debts, and the quickest way to pay them was to sell the farm and everyone on it. Jacob, 22 years old and valuable because of his carpentry skills, was sold to a trader who took him south. The next few years were a blur of different owners and different places. Jacob quickly learned to hide his reading. He watched men and women beaten for smaller things than being able to read, and he understood that his knowledge was a death sentence if found out. He became good at looking ignorant, at moving through spaces without being noticed, at giving people what they expected to see. In 1830, he was bought by Samuel Porter and brought to Cumberland County. Porter needed skilled workers for his growing business, and Jacob's carpentry skills made him immediately valuable. Porter allowed Jacob unusual freedom of movement, trusting him to travel to other plantations to perform repairs and make extra money. For 15 years, Jacob used this freedom to live and eventually to do well in his own quiet way. He built furniture, repaired buildings, and earned a name as one of the best carpenters in the county. He was respectful, reliable, and invisible. Exactly what a white owner wanted from an enslaved worker, but the knowledge he carried haunted him. He saw children growing up in the same darkness he had been saved from, and the weight of his silence became too much. He told himself for years that he couldn't risk it, that teaching would put everyone in danger, that his duty was to survive. But in the spring of 1845, something changed. He had been fixing a fence at the Whitley plantation when he heard a talk between two of the enslaved men working nearby. They were discussing a child who had been sold away from his mother, separated because the owner needed cash. One of the men said, "He is better off not knowing any different. What you don't know can't hurt you." That phrase, "what you don't know can't hurt you," stuck in Jacob's mind like a splinter. He thought about it all day, all week, and he realized that it was a lie, perhaps the biggest lie of the entire system. What you don't know could absolutely hurt you. Not knowing was a weapon used against people, not a shield that protected them. He made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He would teach. Jacob started small and moved with extreme care. His first student was Hannah, the daughter of a woman named Martha, who worked in the Whitley kitchen. Jacob had watched Hannah for weeks, noting her smarts, her curiosity, the way she studied things carefully before acting. One evening, while making repairs to the Whitley barn, he had walked up to her. "Can you keep a secret?" he asked quietly. Hannah, 7 years old, had looked at him with serious eyes. "Yes, I mean a very important secret." "The kind where if you tell anyone, something bad would happen," she nodded. "I can teach you to read," Jacob said, "but only if you promise never to tell anyone, not your mother, not your friends, not anyone." Hannah's eyes widened. "Why would you do that?" "Because you should know," Jacob said simply. "Because everyone should know." They met 3 nights later in the old Whitley tobacco barn, the one that hadn't been used for storage in years. Jacob brought charcoal and used the wooden floor as a slate. He taught Hannah the alphabet, starting with the letter that began her name. She was a quick learner, hungry for knowledge and careful to follow his words about secrecy. After 4 lessons, Jacob felt sure enough to bring in 2 more children, boys named Peter and David from the neighboring Grayson plantation. The lessons followed a pattern. Jacob would arrive just after full dark when most people were tired from the day's work and unlikely to be moving around. He would teach for no more than an hour using things that left no mark. Dirt, charcoal, his memory. He taught the alphabet first, then simple words, then basic sentences. He never brought books, never wrote anything that could be found later. Everything existed only in the moment and in the memories of his students. He was careful about changing his routine. He never came on the same night of the week. He never taught in the same place twice in a row. He never took the same path between properties. He learned to move through the woods at night with an almost magic silence, and he developed a feeling for when it was safe to be somewhere and when he needed to disappear. Over the course of the first year, he taught 11 children. By the second year, that number had grown to 42. He put them into small groups, never more than 6 at a time, and he kept the groups apart, so that if one was found, the others might stay safe. The children, for their part, were very good at keeping the secret. They understood even at young ages that what they were learning was dangerous. They also understood that it was special. Jacob gave them a sense of duty, not just for protecting themselves, but for protecting each other and protecting him. Some of the children moved faster than others. Ruth from the Carver plantation, whom Jacob had met by accident that night at the old barn, turned out to be one of his best students. She soaked up everything he taught with a fire that both impressed and worried him. He could see that she was beginning to see the world differently, to ask questions that had no safe answers. One night, about 6 months into her schooling, Ruth had asked him, "Why don't they want us to read?" Jacob had thought about how to answer, "Because reading gives you power. It lets you understand things they don't want you to understand. It lets you imagine things they don't want you to imagine." Like what? Like the idea that you could be something other than what they tell you you are. Ruth had gone quiet thinking about this. Then she asked, "Are you scared?" "Every day," Jacob admitted, "but I am more scared of not doing this than I am of getting caught." It was the most honest he had ever been with any of his students, and it marked a turning point in their bond. Ruth wasn't just learning to read. She was beginning to understand the deeper meanings of what Jacob was risking and why. By the autumn of 1847, Jacob was teaching over 60 children across 9 different plantations. The work had grown far beyond what he had first planned, and with that growth came more risk. It was becoming harder to keep track of all his students, harder to keep the strict security rules, harder to avoid being seen. He had made a system of signs to talk with the children. A mark on a tree meant a lesson would happen that night. A different mark meant to stay away because it wasn't safe. The children learned to read these signs as carefully as they learned to read letters. But Jacob knew the system was weak. All it would take was one child speaking carelessly, one adult noticing something odd, one lucky patrol catching him in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had close calls, moments when he had to freeze in the shadows while guards passed within feet of him, nights when he arrived at a meeting spot to find it unexpectedly busy and had to cancel the lesson. He began to prepare for the certain discovery. He started teaching the children not just to read but to teach others. He explained to his best students how to form letters, how to sound out words, how to be patient with learners. He told them that if anything happened to him, they should continue carefully in secret, passing the knowledge along. Some of his students took this lesson to heart more than others. Hannah, his first student, had begun teaching her younger brother. Samuel, a boy from the Brennan plantation, had taught two of his cousins. The knowledge was spreading beyond Jacob's direct control, which both pleased and scared him. In September of 1847, Jacob made a choice that would prove fateful. There was a group of children on the Carver plantation that he hadn't yet reached, and Ruth had asked him again and again to teach them. Jacob was unsure. The Carver plantation was one of the most strictly run in the county, and Thomas Carver himself was known for his careful attention to detail. But Ruth was convincing, and Jacob felt a sense of duty to reach as many children as possible. He agreed to teach at the old tobacco barn on the Carver property, using Ruth as a helper to gather students. It was a risk, but it seemed workable. What Jacob didn't know was that the security at the Carver plantation had recently been tightened. Thomas Carver, worried about reports of theft at nearby estates, had started irregular night patrols and had told his guard Hackett to note any strange activity. The plantation that had seemed like a smart risk was actually a trap waiting to spring. The morning Ruth was found reading Thomas Carver's journal marked the beginning of the end, though it would take weeks for the full results to unfold. The immediate result was wild and terrifying. After the gathering of children and the shocking reveal that 7 of them could read, Thomas Carver locked Ruth in a small storage room while he decided what to do. Ruth spent hours in the dark, listening to muffled voices arguing outside, imagining the worst. She was terrified not for herself, but for Jacob. She had made the mistake that would show him. She had been careless, confident, too pleased with her own skills to keep proper care. When the door finally opened, it was Dinah, the head housekeeper, who entered. Dinah's face was blank as she set down a plate of food and a cup of water. "Eat," Dinah said. Ruth stared at the food. "What is going to happen to me?" Dinah sighed. "I don't know, child, but Mr. Carver is sending people to all the nearby plantations. They are testing other children, seeing how far this goes. You have stirred up a hornet's nest." "I didn't mean to," Ruth whispered. "I know, but meaning doesn't matter now." Dinah paused at the door. "Ruth, whoever taught you, you need to protect them. No matter what they threaten you with, you can't say who it was. Do you understand?" Ruth nodded, tears running down her face. Over the following days, as the size of the secret school network became clear, the plantation owners of Cumberland County moved into action. The first shock gave way to organized searching. They made lists of everyone who moved between properties. They questioned adults. They put strict new limits on the movements of enslaved people, and they put up a reward, $200, for information leading to the name of the teacher. $200 was a huge amount, more than many enslaved people could imagine. The planters believed that someone would break, that the promise of money or freedom would crack the wall of silence, but weeks passed and no one came forward. The children were asked again and again, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, but they held firm. They didn't know his name, they said. They didn't know where he came from. He was just the night teacher, and he disappeared like smoke. The search began to focus on men who traveled between plantations for real reasons. Peddlers were questioned. Traveling preachers were asked, and eventually attention turned to the craftsmen, the blacksmiths, the wheelwrights. the carpenters who moved from property to property offering their work. Samuel Porter had always considered himself a smart judge of character. He was proud of his ability to manage his property well while keeping what he believed was a fair approach. He didn't use physical punishment as much as some of his neighbors, and he rewarded good work with small freedoms. Jacob had been one of his success stories, a skilled worker who made money and reflected well on Porter's management skills, but now sitting in his office and thinking about the chance that Jacob might be the mystery teacher, Porter felt a mix of doubt, curiosity, and betrayal. If Jacob had been tricking him for years, what did that say about Porter's judgment? He decided to test Jacob subtly without showing his suspicions. On the morning of October 23rd, Porter called Jacob to his office. "Jacob, I have a task for you," Porter said, pointing to a piece of paper on his desk. "I need you to deliver a message to Thomas Carver tomorrow. Before you go, I want to make sure you understand what it says so you can answer any questions he might have." Porter pushed the paper across the desk. It contained a simple message confirming delivery of tobacco samples for quality check. "Please review and respond by return messenger." Jacob picked up the paper and looked at it for several long seconds. Porter watched his eyes carefully, looking for any sign that he was reading. "I can't read, sir," Jacob said finally, setting the paper down. "But if you tell me what it says, I can remember it and repeat it to Mr. Carver." "Are you certain you can't read?" Porter pressed, not even a little. Jacob met his eyes with a look of mild confusion. "No, sir, I never learned." Porter held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well." The message says he proceeded to explain the content, and Jacob listened closely, repeating it back perfectly, but Porter wasn't satisfied. He sent word to Thomas Carver about his suspicions, and together they made a more detailed test. They would follow Jacob on his next trip. On the night of November 8th, 1847, Jacob left the Porter plantation just after sunset, carrying his leather tool bag and a small lantern. He had told the guard he was going to repair a broken wagon wheel at the Brennan estate, a job that would take several hours. The guard had nodded and waved him on without suspicion. What Jacob didn't know was that 3 men were following him at a careful distance. Thomas Carver had organized the watching personally. He had chosen Hackett, his own guard, along with 2 experienced hunters who knew the county's forests well. The men were armed and had orders to watch, but not to step in until they had real proof. Jacob walked along the main road for the first mile, his speed steady and unhurried. The evening was cool, the sky clear, and a thin moon provided just enough light to make the road visible. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a carpenter heading to a job. But when he reached the split in the road where one branch led to the Brennan plantation, Jacob didn't take it. Instead, he continued straight toward a less traveled path that led deeper into the woods. The men following him exchanged glances. This was already suspicious. Hackett signaled for silence, and they continued tracking Jacob through the forest. Jacob walked for another 30 minutes, occasionally pausing to listen, once stopping completely for several minutes, as though sensing something. The trackers froze each time, barely breathing. Finally, Jacob seemed satisfied and continued on. He came out into a small clearing near an old mill that had been abandoned for over a decade. The building was partially collapsed, its water wheel stuck and overgrown with vines. Jacob circled around to the back of the mill and entered through a hole in the wall. The men tracking him crept closer, placing themselves where they could see without being seen. They waited. 10 minutes passed. Then, from various directions, small figures began to appear, children moving silently through the darkness toward the mill. The trackers counted 6 of them, ranging in age from perhaps 7 to 12. The children entered the mill through the same hole Jacob had used. Hackett leaned close to one of the other men and whispered, "We have got him." Inside the mill, Jacob had set up his classroom. He had cleared a space on the floor and had several pieces of slate that he had hidden there. He used charcoal to write on the slates, teaching the children new words and reviewing old lessons. His voice was low and patient. "This word is freedom," he said, writing it carefully. "It is an important word. Do you know what it means?" One of the children, a boy named Thomas, raised his hand. "It means not being owned by anyone." "That is right," Jacob said. "Now, let's break it down into sounds." The lesson continued for nearly 45 minutes. Jacob worked with each child individually, checking their progress, correcting mistakes, offering praise. The feeling was focused and quiet, with none of the fidgeting you might expect from young children. They understood the privilege and the danger of what they were doing. When the lesson ended, Jacob carefully wiped the slates and hid them in a hole in the mill wall. He sent the children home one at a time, spaced a few minutes apart, telling them to take different routes. "Remember," he told them, "tell no one and be careful." The children disappeared into the night. Jacob waited until they were gone, then gathered his things and prepared to leave. He never made it out of the clearing. As he came out from the mill, Hackett and the two trackers stepped out from the tree line, blocking his path. Hackett held a lantern high, lighting up Jacob's face. "Jacob," Hackett said, his voice calm but cold, "you have been a very busy man." Jacob froze, his hand tightening on his tool bag. For a moment the night was silent, except for the sound of wind in the trees. Jacob's mind raced through possibilities, running, fighting, denying, but he knew it was over. They had seen everything. "Mr. Carver wants to speak with you," Hackett continued. "You are going to come with us now." Jacob looked at the three men, at the darkness of the forest behind them, at the road that led back to a life that was now forever changed. He took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "All right," he said quietly, "I will come." They tied his hands and led him through the forest toward the Carver plantation. Jacob walked in silence, his mind already working through the meanings. He had been caught, but the children hadn't. If he could protect their names, if he could keep them safe, perhaps something of his work would survive. Jacob was held in a locked storage shed on the Carver plantation, while Thomas Carver sent urgent messages to every plantation owner within 20 miles. By the afternoon of November 9th, over 30 men had gathered in Carver's largest barn, which had been cleared and furnished with benches for the event. Jacob could hear the murmur of voices from his prison, the sound of horses arriving, the growing crowd of angry men who had come to decide his fate. He sat on the dirt floor, his back against the wall, and waited. Inside the barn, Thomas Carver stood on a raised platform, speaking to the gathered planters. The feeling was charged with anger and fear. "Gentlemen," Carver began, "we have caught the individual responsible for the planned education of slave children across 7 counties. His name is Jacob, property of Samuel Porter, and he has admitted to teaching reading skills to over 60 children over a period of roughly 2 years. A roar of angry voices filled the barn. Men stood shouting questions and demands. "Hang him, make an example. How do we know he worked alone?" Carver raised his hands for silence. "We have questioned him deeply. He claims to have worked alone, and I believe him. His method was simple but effective. He used his real carpentry work as cover to travel between properties, and he held lessons in abandoned or quiet locations at night. He was careful, planned, and patient. How did we not see this?" Someone shouted from the back. Carver's jaw tightened, because he understood our systems better than we understood them ourselves. He knew our routines, our blind spots, our assumptions. He used the very freedom of movement we gave him because he was valuable and trusted. Samuel Porter stood, his face red. "I take blame for failing to see this. Jacob has been my property for 20 years, and I never suspected. I will pay any costs tied to this event." "The cost," said Martin Grayson, "is not just money. The cost is that we now have 60 educated slave children who represent a lasting threat to stability. They can read, they can write, they can talk in ways we can't watch, and worse, We don't know if they will teach others. This thought sent a new wave of concern through the group. Men who had been focused on punishing Jacob now began to realize the wider meanings. "What do we do about the children?" asked Robert Brennan. Carver had prepared for this question. "We have made a complete list of all children Jacob taught. I suggest that we separate them, sell them to different regions, mainly far south, where their skills will be less useful, and where they will have no connection to each other or to anyone who might encourage more education." "That is over 60 sales," Porter said. "The money impact alone." "The other choice," Carver stopped him, "is to keep them here where they pose an ongoing risk, and where they might continue to spread reading. Gentlemen, we are not just dealing with the children Jacob taught directly. We are dealing with the chance that those children will teach others who will teach others. This is a sickness, and it must be stopped." The room fell silent as the men took in the size of the problem. Finally, James Whitley spoke up. "And what about Jacob himself?" All eyes turned to Samuel Porter, who stood and addressed the group. "I have given this much thought. Killing him would make him a hero and would draw unwanted attention from people against slavery in the North. They would use his story to attack our entire way of life. I suggest instead that we sell him as far south as possible to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the work is hard and the life length is short. He will disappear, and his story will die with him." "I agree," Carver said. "We should handle this quietly. No public trial, no show, no records that might be found later and used against us. Jacob simply disappears. The children are separated and sold, and we put in new security steps to ensure this never happens again." The vote was nearly total. Jacob would be sold to a slave trader heading to Louisiana within the week. The children would be separated and sold over the following months, and the entire event would be written down as vaguely as possible in official records to avoid creating evidence that could be used by anti-slavery people. On the evening before Jacob was to be taken away, Thomas Carver made a choice that surprised even himself. He wanted to understand. Despite his anger, despite the threat Jacob had been, Carver felt forced to speak with the man who had outsmarted him and dozens of other educated, powerful men for over 2 years. Carver entered the shed where Jacob was being held. Jacob sat against the wall, his hands still tied, his face showing tiredness and acceptance. Carver carried a lantern and a bottle of water which he offered to Jacob. "Thank you," Jacob said, drinking deeply. Carver sat down on a wooden box across from him. For a long moment neither man spoke. Finally Carver broke the silence. "I need to understand something, Jacob. You had a good spot. You were skilled, valued, trusted. You had freedoms that most men in your spot never receive. Why would you risk all of that? What could you possibly hope to do?" Jacob looked at him steadily. "I hoped to give those children something that couldn't be taken away from them. Knowledge, understanding, the ability to see the world as it truly is, not as you tell them it is. But you must have known you would be caught eventually," Carver pressed. "You must have known the results." "I knew," Jacob said simply, "but I also knew that if I didn't act, I would be part of keeping those children in darkness. I had been given something special, education, and I couldn't justify keeping it to myself while others suffered for lack of it." Carver shook his head. "You have put them in danger, Jacob. Don't you see that? By teaching them to read, you have made them unfit for their lives. You have given them hopes they can never reach. You have created unhappiness where there should have been acceptance. That is not mercy, that is cruelty." For the first time, anger flashed in Jacob's eyes. "The cruelty is in the system that makes education dangerous. The cruelty is in telling human beings that they are not allowed to use their minds." "The cruelty is yours, Mr. Carver, not mine." Carver stood abruptly. "You are wrong. The world has a natural order, and that order exists for good reasons. When people accept their place in that order, everyone is better off. What you have done is sow chaos, "No," Jacob said quietly. "What I have done is plant seeds, and you can sell me, and you can sell those children, and you can try to erase every trace of what happened here. But those seeds will grow. Maybe not today, maybe not for years, but they will grow." Carver stared at him, disturbed by the certainty in Jacob's voice. "You are fooling yourself if you think your actions will change anything." Jacob smiled faintly. "Time will tell, Mr. Carver." Carver left the shed without another word, but the conversation haunted him. There had been something in Jacob's face, not fight exactly, but a kind of patient trust that upset him deeply. The weeks following Jacob's capture were chaotic across Cumberland County. The plantation owners moved quickly to put their plan in action, but the doing proved more hard than expected. The first problem was finding all the children Jacob had taught. The initial count of 63 turned out to be low. As more thorough testing was done, the number climbed to 78, then to 91. Some children had learned only the basics and had kept it secret so well that even their parents didn't know. Others had taught siblings or friends, growing the network beyond Jacob's direct reach. The second problem was the reaction of the enslaved community itself. Word of Jacob's capture spread quickly, and with it came a mixture of sadness, anger, and fear. People who had never met Jacob mourned him as a hero. Parents whose children had been taught felt torn between pride in their children's skills and terror for their safety. Some of the children who had been found tried to protect others by refusing to reveal the full size of the network. Ruth, despite facing great pressure, never told the names of other students she knew about. Hannah did the same. This protective spirit, this loyalty to the group Jacob had created, made the planters' job of holding it in much more difficult. The third problem was the money and moving challenge of selling over 90 children. The local slave market couldn't take that many young workers at once without raising questions and driving down prices. The sales had to be spread out over months, sent to different regions, carefully managed to avoid drawing attention. Thomas Carver personally watched over the sale of the 7 children from his plantation. Ruth was sold to a family in Georgia in December 1847. She was 9 years old, and she carried with her the knowledge Jacob had given her, hidden but safe. Carver received a fair price for her, and he told himself he was being fair, even kind. She could have been punished far more harshly. But at night, alone in his library, Carver found himself troubled by thoughts he couldn't quite put into words. He had won. Jacob was gone. The children were being moved, and new security steps were in place. Yet he felt as though he had lost something, or perhaps that something had been shown that he wished had stayed hidden. He began writing down the event in his personal journal, writing detailed accounts of the search and capture. But he found himself unable to describe Jacob in simple terms. Criminal felt not enough. Rebel was too dramatic. He settled on teacher, then crossed it out and wrote troublemaker, then crossed that out too. Finally, he left the space blank, unable to find a word that captured what Jacob had been. Jacob was sold to a slave trader named Dixon on November 15, 1847. Dixon worked in moving enslaved people from Virginia to the Deep South, where need for labor in the growing cotton and sugar businesses was high. Jacob was chained alongside 14 other men and 3 women in the back of a wagon that would take them first to Richmond, then by boat down the coast to New Orleans. The trip took 3 weeks. Jacob spent most of it in silence, watching the land change as they moved south. He thought about the children he had taught, wondering what would happen to them, hoping that they would remember what he had shown them. In New Orleans, Jacob was sold at auction to a man from a sugar plantation in Louisiana. The plantation was one of the largest and most money-making in the state, and it was also one of the most brutal. Workers worked 16-hour days during the busy season, and the death rate was high. Jacob was put to work in the fields at first, despite his carpentry skills, as a form of punishment for his past mistake. The guard had been told about his history and made it clear that Jacob would not be given any chances to spread his knowledge. But the planter who had bought him, a man named Richard Beaumont, eventually saw Jacob's value as a carpenter and moved him to fixing work. Jacob spent the remaining years of his life repairing tools, building structures, and keeping his reading secret. He never taught again. The watching was too tight, the results too severe, and his spirit, while not broken, was worn down by the weight of what he had lost. He died in 1852, 5 years after leaving Virginia during a sickness that swept through the plantation. He was buried in an unmarked grave alongside dozens of other workers who died that season. No record was made of his life, his skills, or his work. In the official papers of the Beaumont plantation, he appeared only as Jacob Carpenter, bought 1847, died 1852. The man who had taught over 100 children to read had become a footnote, a line in a book, a number. The children Jacob taught were scattered across the South. Their stories went in countless directions, and most of those stories have been lost to history. But pieces remain, hints of how Jacob's work lasted despite every effort to erase it. Ruth, sold to a family in Georgia, worked as a house servant for the next 16 years. She never forgot how to read, though she rarely had a chance to practice. When the Civil War ended and she gained her freedom, she was 27 years old. She made her way to Atlanta, where she found work and eventually joined one of the schools set up by the Freedmen's Bureau. She became a teacher herself, teaching former slaves basic reading. One of her students later wrote about her. Miss Ruth was different from other teachers. She understood what it meant to learn in secret, to protect knowledge like a treasure. She never took education for granted, and she never let us take it for granted either. Ruth died in 1889, having taught hundreds of students over her life. She never spoke publicly about Jacob. The habit of secrecy was too deeply kept, but she kept a small piece of charcoal in her things until the end of her life, a memory of her first lessons in that abandoned barn. Hannah, Jacob's first student, was sold to a plantation in Alabama. She was 11 when she arrived, and she spent the next decade working in the fields, but she taught her younger brother to read using the same ways Jacob had used with her dirt, charcoal, stolen moments of privacy. Her brother in turn taught others. By the time the Civil War broke the plantation system, a small network of reading enslaved people existed on that Alabama property, all coming from the knowledge Hannah had brought with her. Samuel, the boy from the Brennan plantation who had shown such skill, was sold to a family in South Carolina. He lost his reading skills over the years. Without practice or help, the knowledge faded. But when rebuilding brought schools to his area, he relearned quickly, his brain remembering patterns it had learned as a child. He became a preacher and taught himself to read the Bible well. He died in 1901, a respected elder in his town. Not all the stories ended well. Some of the children Jacob taught were sold to especially harsh places where any show of reading would have been punished severely. Some died young, their promise never met. Some simply disappeared into the vast, poorly written history of enslaved people in the American South. But together, they represented something that the plantation owners of Cumberland County had feared and could not fully understand: the impossibility of holding back knowledge once it was released. Each child Jacob taught carried seeds of understanding that could not be fully stopped. Some of those seeds laid sleeping for years. Others found room in unlikely soil and grew in strange directions. In the years following Jacob's capture, the planters of Cumberland County put in place strict new security measures. They limited travel between plantations. They did random reading tests. They destroyed or locked abandoned buildings that could serve as secret meeting places. They set up spy networks and offered rewards for information about secret schooling. But they also began to realize the basic problem with their plan. You cannot unknow something. The children who had learned to read didn't forget, even when they pretended to. The knowledge existed in their minds, safe from watching, impossible to take away. Thomas Carver, in his careful journals, wrote about his growing frustration with this reality. In a note from March 1848, he wrote, "We have taken every reasonable step. Yet I remain troubled by the knowledge that roughly 90 individuals on properties within this county have skills that could hurt stability. We cannot watch their thoughts, cannot erase their memories. We have closed the source of the sickness, but the sickness itself stays. This troubles me greatly. By 1850, most of the children Jacob had taught had been sold and moved, but new worries came up. Rumors moved of other night teachers in nearby counties. Some of these rumors were based on real cases, copycat teachers inspired by stories of Jacob's work. Others were simply fear, the planter class seeing shadows everywhere. The fear of reading became almost crazy in some places. Laws that had existed on the books but were rarely used began to be used more strictly. White teachers who showed care for ending slavery found themselves under suspicion. Free black people who showed education were viewed with anger and doubt, but the system was naturally leaky. Knowledge moved through informal paths that no amount of laws or watching could fully close. Reading enslaved people taught family members in whispers, in brief moments of privacy. Free black people shared information in churches and social gatherings. And as the 1850s moved on and tensions over slavery grew nationally, the flow of forbidden knowledge increased rather than decreased. When the Civil War began in 1861, the world that Jacob had moved through so carefully began to fall apart. The plantation system, which had seemed forever to those who gained from it, showed itself to be weak and dependent on conditions that could change. Cumberland County itself became a battleground. Union and Confederate forces moved through the area repeatedly, and the plantations that had been centers of wealth and control became targets for destruction. Fields were burned, buildings were taken, and the enslaved population faced new chances and dangers. Many of the children Jacob had taught were adults by this time, in their 20s or 30s. Some of them escaped to Union lines where their reading skills made them valuable as scouts, translators, and helpers. Others remained on the plantations, living through the chaos as best they could. The Carver plantation, Thomas Carver's carefully managed land, was taken by Union forces in 1864. Carver himself had died 2 years earlier, and his widow Elizabeth struggled to keep the property in the face of wartime trouble. The enslaved workers, feeling the changing times, began to assert themselves in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. When Union officers arrived to check the plantation's goods, they were surprised to find several of the workers could read and write. One officer noted in his report, "Contrary to what we thought, found many reading Negroes on the Carver property. They claim to have been taught years ago by a traveling teacher. Though details are vague, these people have proven valuable in organizing work details and keeping records." The officer had no way of knowing that he was seeing the distant ripples of Jacob's work. Knowledge that had survived years of holding back and had now found suddenly useful in a changed world. The records discovered in Richmond in 1932 were part of a larger collection of county papers that had been moved from Cumberland County to the state capital during rebuilding and never properly organized. A clerk doing account during courthouse repairs found a series of leather-bound books marked Confidential County Business 1847-1851. The books contained detailed reports of the search into Jacob's teaching network. There were lists of children tested for reading, maps showing affected plantations, letters between plantation owners, and detailed notes of security steps put in place in response to the crisis. What made these documents particularly interesting to history experts was how completely they went against the public story of the South before the war. The plantation owners had painted themselves as kind masters ruling over a happy and ignorant workforce. These documents revealed men who lived in constant fear of their own workers, who saw threats in every shadow, who understood that their system of control was far more weak than they admitted publicly. The historian who first examined the documents in detail, a man named Dr. Robert Patterson, was struck by the tone of the letters. "These are not confident men," he wrote in his first notes. "These are frightened men engaged in a desperate effort to hold back something they don't fully understand." The figure of Jacob haunts these pages not as a criminal, but as something more disturbing, a mirror showing their own failures of imagination. Patterson spent several weeks studying the documents, checking names and dates with other historical records. He discovered that many of the children mentioned in the reports had gone on to important lives after freedom. At least 7 had become teachers. 3 had been elected to local offices during rebuilding. 1 had published a book that made no mention of her childhood education, keeping the secrecy even decades later. But Patterson's research was stopped by pressure from local history groups and families of the plantation owners mentioned in the documents. They argued that the records were upsetting, that they showed a twisted view of history, that they would be misused by those with political goals. The state archive director, facing growing pressure, decided to reseal the documents and limit access. Patterson fought hard, but he was overruled. In his final report he wrote, "The story contained in these documents deserves to be told not because it makes anyone look good, but because it reveals the truth about a system built on the impossible task of keeping human beings ignorant." Jacob succeeded not because he was special, but because the plantation owner's greatest fear, that enslaved people were fully human, fully able to learn, was absolutely true. They spent huge energy denying this reality, and the proof of their denial is now being hidden again. This time in the name of historical feelings. The documents were resealed in 1933, marked not important, and filed in a restricted section of the state archives. They remained there largely forgotten for decades. While the official records were hidden, the story of Jacob lasted in spoken stories within African American communities, though in broken and often changed forms. Families of the people Jacob taught sometimes heard family stories about a mysterious teacher who appeared in the night, though details were vague and often mixed with other tales. In a 1937 interview done as part of the Federal Writers Project, an elderly woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had been enslaved in Cumberland County, told an interviewer, "My grandmother used to tell me about the night school. Said there was a man who came around teaching children their letters had to be secret because it was forbidden. She never said his name, but she said he was like a ghost, could move through the dark without making a sound. My grandmother learned from him, and she taught my mother, and my mother taught me. All secret, all passed down quiet, like—" The interviewer asked for more details, but Sarah had none to give. The details had been lost over 3 generations of retelling. The man had become a legend, a symbol, his real name hidden by time and the need for secrecy. Similar stories appeared in interviews done across Virginia and other southern states. Historians noted the pattern, but generally dismissed these accounts as folk tales, big stories that mixed facts with wishing. The academic belief was that while there may have been rare cases of enslaved people learning to read, the idea of organized secret schools was largely a myth. But the people who told these stories believed them. For them, the night teacher, whether he was one person or many, whether his story was correct in every detail or grew through retelling, represented a basic truth that the hunger for knowledge had been powerful enough to beat terrible risks, and that people had been willing to teach and learn even when it could cost them everything. In 1968, during the Civil Rights Movement, a group of historians led by Dr. Julia Morrison began pushing for the reopening of the 1847-1851 documents from Cumberland County. They argued that these records held important proof of resistance to slavery and should be made available for study and teaching. The Virginia State Archives at first said no, citing the same worries that had led to the documents being sealed in the first place. But under sustained pressure and in the context of a wider re-look at Southern history taking place across the region, the archives agreed to review the restriction. A group was formed to examine the documents and decide whether they should be made open to the public. The group spent several months analyzing the materials, and their report, issued in 1969, concluded, "These documents represent an important historical record of both the smartness of resistance to slavery and the depth of fear that resistance created among slaveholders. They should be made available for study with proper backing."